Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Rising Laterally podcast. This is Arjun Sachdev.
And this is Jay Ballou. We hope you find something here that offers you new meaning or a fresh perspective.
If you do, we encourage you to give it life.
Be bold.
Experiment.
And most importantly, bring it into the interactions with the people you surround yourself with.
And see what happens. Okay, if you're listening to this, something we have in common from living today is that at one point, we all thought about money. Jay, me, our guest Jeff, and you are all connected in that way. It's something that we think about all the time, yet rarely have any open discussions about, but we should be, because if you look at science and if you look at our brains, it's something that tricks us all the time. And right now, when people are buzzing about a $1,400 stimulus check, and it's a desperate time in our country when the unemployment rate's at 6.2%, we wanted someone to uncover some of these psychological traps and raise our awareness of how we fool ourselves and then allow companies to fool us too. So it's a hell of a double whammy. So I'm excited to introduce you to Jeff Kreisler. Jeff is a Princeton educated lawyer who is also an award-winning comedian who won the Bill Hicks Spirit Award in 2006 for Best Thought-Provoking Comedy. He's also an author, a speaker, a columnist, and an advocate for behavioral science. So much so that he is currently the head of behavioral science at JP Morgan. Jeff, welcome to the show, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Thank you guys for inviting me. And do I have to do an official disclaimer that this is not advice on investments? I think now that I've joined the big bad companies, I have to tell people I'm just talking from the hip. I'm not telling you what to do, right?
I think that's a fair disclaimer. Yeah.
These are
now. What's
absolutely
interesting is you're hinting at all the companies that try to trick us. A lot of people wouldn't be so nice, but I'm not trying to trick anybody today. Send me all your money. I'm not trying to trick anyone. Send me all your money.
That's not what we're trying to do here. But to get us started, and before we dig into the books, tell us about how you actually came to this point. I mean, what was the series of events that sparked this journey that you've been on? Because you're really trying to help people better understand why we make so many of these common mistakes, especially with our money.
Sure. That's a great question. And it will take several decades to fully explain. I'll try to give you the 2.5 minute version. After graduating from an Ivy League school with an economics degree and then a top law school, I did what most people do, which is I moved to San Francisco and became a stand-up comedian.
Of course.
Looking back now, what I see in common between comedy and behavioral science is that the comedian is, that it's like, hey, did you ever notice people do this stupid thing? And behavioral science says, yeah, and this is why. So they sort of yin yang together for me. Of course, I didn't realize that at the time what I was doing a lot of political humor, and I was trying to sort of expose some hypocrisy and how people trick themselves and were tricked by others into like either voting a certain way or spending their money on things. And a long story short is that then led to writing a column for Jim Cramer's TheStreet.com on financial news, sort of a humor weekly, just monologue jokes. And then that led to my first book, which was called Get Rich Cheating. It was a satire. It was like Stephen Colbert meets Jim Cramer meets Tony Robbins, right? Like an advice book, but pointing all the cheating from Enron to real estate scams to steroids, things in show business and politics. And it just sort of continued this theme of mine of like sort of saying like, look at all these things that are like how you're being tricked. I then met through the book a gentleman by the name of Dan Ariely, who your readers should know if they don't know. He is one of the leading thinkers in the field of behavioral science. His big book was called Predictably Irrational. And we connected. I came and lectured at his class at Duke, and I did it in this character from Get Rich Cheating, sort of the cheater. And, this Tony Robbins guy, like, hey, get your life together. And I told his Duke business students, I'm like, look, cost benefit analysis. And there's no cost, right? No one ever gets caught. One guy, Bernie Madoff, everyone else gets free. And the benefits are huge. And it was eye-opening for a couple reasons. One was there was always some far too large percentage of the business class that was like, yeah, right, good idea. And the second really important is it exposed me to this whole field of behavioral economics or behavioral science, which wasn't a thing. Like when I was in college, it's really only sort of blown up in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like it filled the gap for me when I like had studied economics. The reason why I sort of like I got good, I could pass a test, but it didn't connect because it was like everything was cold calculations based on perfect information, and that's just not how people are. It didn't have the human element, right? Like
Right.
economics
It's
says you
too
go into a
linear.
store and the milk is 25 cents more than the store next door. You go next door, but human reality is like you got a screaming kid in the car. You're texting somebody, like you just don't
Yeah.
do that. And so to wrap up, basically, like I worked with Dan, I learned about his field. We did some small projects, and then he's like, "Hey, do you want to help me write this book?" Which is the book that we're here today about dollars and cents, all about financial decision making. I did that. I fell in love with the field. I wanted to become an advocate, and then I ran a website called People Science, which is all about behavioral economics applied not just to financial decision making, but like motivation and engagement and design. And I also did a bunch of speaking and consulting, and then I ended up at where I am now, which is talking to you two. So I don't know.
Wonderful.
Was that 2.5? It felt like about 4 minutes.
Time doesn't exist, only the event does. So that
True.
was great. Yeah, no, we appreciate that because at the end of the day, it digs into the psychology that you want to help us with. And as we segue into your books, that psychology of how we handle money is so important right now. I already mentioned the stimulus checks and the unemployment rate, but the other thing is our technology and how a lot of us are now walking around without wallets. And so having this awareness of how we can be tricked is pretty important. So as we go into your book, you break it into 3 parts. First, what is money? Then how we assess value in ways that have little to do with value, which I thought was hilarious. And then, okay, how do we actually build on these shoulders that actually have such flawed thinking? So just to get basics out of the way, how would you define money? What does it do to us? What does it do for us? And then
Right.
how do we actually value things? How do we know it's actually accurate? Let's just get some of the basics out of the way.
Sure. Um, I'd love to add a basic that I really discovered after writing the book, but it's
Oh,
important. And that if there's a takeaway for your listeners, is that money is hard to think about, and everyone thinks about money incorrectly. Like what I have found speaking to like wealth advisors is that even those that are great at telling others what to do often make money mistakes themselves. And the reason
fascinating.
is because it's emotional, right? When you tell someone else, hey, look at this chart and the numbers, it's easy. But then when it's about yourself, it's your own future and kids and all this other stuff. So one big takeaway before we get into the details is that everyone makes mistakes, and talking about it and asking questions, whether it's for your family or neighbors or a professional advisor, like that's healthy. And don't be ashamed of not knowing what to do, because everybody makes these mistakes. Getting off my high horse, to the question of like sort of like what is money, and broadly why it messes with us is, money is like really awesome. I used to be sort of a money is the root of all evil type of guy, but then and when I learned more about it, it really like it is divisible, right? You can break it. Like compare money to like a world without money. It's divisible. It's fungible. It's storable. All these features of it have made it so society could blossom. So it's great. But then, like, how do we really think about it? It's in terms of opportunity cost, right? Which, not to give people that Econ 101 flashback, but essentially, when we make a financial decision, we're supposed to weigh this choice, like, am I going to buy this item, against the opportunity costs, which are what else I could do with that money now or any time in the future. Right.
Right.
And, like Susie Orman's classic, like, don't buy a $5 latte. You could invest that in compound interest. You'll be a millionaire. Right. Like, first of all, enjoy your life. Have a nice coffee. Don't worry about Susie Orman. But she's on to the point of like, it could do something else. And the real challenge is that like, that's just an impossible calculation, because it's what could I do now or any time in the future. Right. Like $5 could be 5 lottery tickets. It could be, 1/1,000,000th of a $5 million home. Like it could be so many. It's just way too hard, and we're not going to go through life making that calculation. So instead, we sort of seek shortcuts. We seek shortcuts to gauge the opportunity cost, which is really like, what is the value of this potential purchase or spend. We seek shortcuts because they're emotionally satisfying, and they prevent us from thinking, hey, we're too lazy and stupid from to weigh the opportunity cost, but instead I get it, right? And we fall for these shortcuts because they sort of like just like ring a little bell, and they're like, oh, you're right. And sometimes it's a sale price, sometimes it's a brand name, sometimes it's how we or our parents spent money before. It's these little things that make us feel like we're doing the right thing. And again, everyone does it. And my sort of philosophy with all this is that we can't change human nature when it comes to financial decision making or in general, but when we can understand our own human nature, like why we make certain decisions, whether it's why we fall for sale prices, et cetera, then once we recognize what we're doing, we can try to put in systems or structures so that we get to better outcomes. Like it's sort of like trying to become like any kind of habit, right? It's hard to change who you are innately, but you can do little tricks to get yourself there. Like put your sneakers and shorts by your bed so you can go work out more easily. Same sort of thing financially. Find little ways to help us work with the flaws that we have.
Absolutely. And to piggyback off of that, just from our experience in asset management, I mean, Jay and I used to work with financial advisors every single day. And by far, one of the most popular one pagers that we would have in a meeting would be around these like investing with emotions, or like, how does it feel when you lose $10 versus win $10? And like, what if you don't save for retirement versus saving for a few bucks or saving a few bucks? And we're just helping tell that story to the financial advisor because it's such a common thing. Like they literally bring it up in every single meeting with every one of their clients. And so it just hits on that point. And one thing I read in your book that I found fascinating was that I think you said up to 60% of financial advisors don't even have their own retirement plan.
Yeah. It's an older stat from like 2010 or something, but I think for some reason 47% sticks in my head, but regardless, it's too high. Some surveys said that like a certain amount of financial advisors didn't even have a plan themselves, which doesn't mean they're bad advisors. It just shows that like when it comes to our own stuff, can I swear on this?
Yeah.
When it comes to our own gosh darn stuff, we get emotional and it's hard to decide.
Yeah. So when we get into the meat of your book, I mean, you really start with the fact that we really forget that things are relative. So the effect of relativity, and you gave us the example of J.C. Penney and their sales tactics. And I think that's a great way to get into some of the meat of the book, Dollars and Cents here.
So J.C. Penney and other stores like this, but J.C. Penney is a great example. Their business model was basically like everything is listed overpriced. But then they provide a lot of ways for customers to get discounts. Either they walk in and it's like, hey, 40% off everything, or there are coupons, or like, repeat customers get 20% off. It's basically like setting everything up for a discount. And what happened is they did that for a while. Then they got a new CEO who's like, this is stupid. Let's just trust our clients or, customers. And let's just give them the fair and square price, what the price is. And they did that, and all their customers left.
Wow.
Even though they actually would have spent probably less than normal, they left. And then they fired him. The new CEO put back in their old trickery, and the customers, for the most part, came back. Not entirely, but some came back. And it just, what that story shows is the power of sale prices. And, there's a lot of things at play here. I mean, there's one area we didn't really dive into, but just sort of that, again, that like a dopamine rush of, hey, I found a sale, feels good. But more to the point within, the science world where I explore it is this idea of relativity. A $100 sweater marked down to $60 will sell more than just a $60 sweater. Because when you look at it and you don't know how to assess, again, that opportunity cost, right? Is a $60 sweater, like, how do I measure what that value is and what else it could be? That's a hard lift to just see that. But when you see a $100 one marked down to 60, you can compare 100 to 60 easily and say, oh, 60 is better than 100. And then you're like, wow, I did this. I saved $40, dollars. Like I did the smart thing, right? It made me feel good. And that's an easy way to make a decision. And ultimately that's why we fall for these sale prices. The example I often give when I talk to folks is like, which question is easier to answer? First, what would you like for dinner? Or second, would you like chicken or fish for dinner? And most people answering the second question is easier because you can compare. Oh, I like chicken more than fish, which is wrong. Fish is just healthier. But anyway, I like chicken more than fish. Versus what would you like for dinner is like, it could be anything, right? It's like opportunity cost. Like it could be nothing. It could be a hamburger. Who knows what it could be? And that's essentially what relativity does. When we set up, or companies set up, a comparison for us in products or prices, that is like just an easy, intuitive, emotional way to make a choice, is to compare the two. And it plays out in stuff like sale prices. It plays out in like essentially percentages. Like, most people, if they went shopping at an office supply store to buy, like a $25 pack of paper, printer paper, and the clerk at the front was like, "Oh, it's available next door for $5." Most people would go next door because they're like, "Oh my God, that's an 80% saving," or whatever. I can't do math. But if like later that day they went to a mattress store and bought like $1,000 mattress, and the clerk was like, "Oh, it's available next door for $980," they wouldn't go next door. But it's the same $20 walk. It just feels different. Products, right? Like when a new product comes out and it's compared to some other in features, like that influences like how we assess the value of it. Even like the iPhone is a classic example. When the iPhone came out, no one knew what a smartphone was, right? And so Steve Jobs came out in his turtleneck, and he's like, "Oh, my engineers say this is worth $800, but we're going to sell it for $600." And everyone's like, "Yay!" Like they have no idea how to assess it. And it's just like, I mean, it's depending on how long I have when I talk with people, I just, even more philosophically, like that's one of the dangers of social media, right? You compare yourself to others. Or just in life in general, like you compare your life that you have to some idealized life you might have, and it just, you can see it whether it's in sale prices or otherwise. Like comparing is a psychological trick, and it's one of the biggest things. One of the things that got the most reaction to the book is people coming and writing and saying, "Hey, I read this and you've ruined shopping for me." And they don't know if they want to say thank you or F you because I've ruined shopping for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like insofar as life in a developed consumer economy really just being a series of transactions throughout the day, it would be overwhelming if you had to truly assess the opportunity cost of like each transaction you're making. It would be a total overload. So even though we're taking advantage by some of these shortcuts and, the discount mechanism being one of them, in some sense, it's to our benefit because it actually allows us to make faster decisions, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, the book and most of what I do is framed around sort of the mistakes that we make. But as we may get into, like, sometimes it's good and healthy to do these things, and sometimes there's a ways to use these sort of biases to our advantage. Like I like to talk a lot, maybe we're getting into it, about the pain of paying, which is something essentially, to oversimplify it, we can get a more deep part. It's sort of about the friction of payment. Right? The more we feel the payment, the more conscious we are of it. And so a lot of products like fintech and Apple Pay and all this stuff makes it easy for us to spend because we don't feel the pain. We don't have to pull out our money, and that's a problem. But you could also flip that on your head, and a lot of companies make it easier to save for retirement, right? If that's the default option, or products like Acorns that make it easy to save for stuff. So, I come at it in a these are problems perspective, because I think for the most part these things do cause us financial problems. But at the same time, there can be good things to it.
But when it comes to the pain of paying, it's basically that we're just going to choose easy, painless, frictionless, thoughtless, basically 99% of the time.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd throw that number on it. I have to be responsible scientist. But it makes it. It's like credit cards are the perfect example of reducing the pain of paying. And I should back up. Just think about humans. Like pain serves a purpose, right? When you feel pain, it makes you stop and think about what's happened. Right? You put your hand on a stove, that burn makes you look at your hand and take it off. Right? You bang your knee, you look at your knee, you maybe go to a doctor or whatever. You get rejected asking a girl out in 7th grade, and you spend your life doing comedy and talking. But anyway, that's what is supposed to happen. And it does happen financially, but as we have evolved, if you will, financially, we've tended to numb the pain. right? Instead of feeling it, we find ways so that we don't feel the pain. And that makes it so we stop paying attention to what's happening, right? Like you pay with cash, that's the most painful. It's why some financial advisors say if you're really having trouble spending, take a month and just pay with cash for everything, and it'll slow you down. Like you'll feel it, you'll stop and think about it. Cash, checks are less painful. Debit card, credit cards, and all these fintechs and Easy Pass and automatic bill pay. That's sort of the broad spectrum. But what they do, credit cards again be the example, is there are two elements of the pain of paying. One is the time between when you purchase something and you face the consequences of that, right? Like if you go out to dinner and you pay with your credit card, you're not actually giving up money then. You're signing a promise to pay later. And then later comes and like you're not really paying for something. Man, that dinner happened 3 weeks ago. So credit cards have you coming and going. And the more time there is, the greater that gap is between the financial decision and the consequences of it, the less attention we pay to it. And there's some really fun experiments that my co-author did with like making people pay per bite of pizza, because that is actually paying at the very moment of consumption. So people would take these giant bites and it would be like unpleasant pizza eating because they were shoving the whole thing in their mouth, but it was cheap. So and that's part of the pay. And then the other element just broadly is like how much of we're like just literally aware of the fact that we're paying. Like I have stuff on automatic bill pay. Like I pay my cable bill every month, it just goes out. Right now, that's makes it easier to pay, but it also makes it easier to pay. And my philosophy and what I tell people is like automatic bill pay can be useful, right? It saves us some time and some stress, but you got to like check in on it every 3 months or 6 months. Otherwise, you're just going to forget. Like you got, Disney Plus and Netflix and all this, like $15 going out 20 times a month is a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. You kind of have to walk that tightrope between being conscious of what you're paying for and feeling like the pain of paying enough to be in tune with how much you're spending in light of your budget, but also, not punishing yourself by maybe paying for a piece of pizza by the bite. It's kind of like you're stuck between these two worlds and trying to live a healthy, fun life and at the same time, tend to your budget. Sometimes those things are in conflict.
Yeah, and that's an overall thing to keep in mind with your financial spending is we don't prescribe that you do like weigh the opportunity cost with everything. That would be the best for your wallet, but would drive you insane. Just choosing your spots, right? Like if every day you get like you have a barista and you do a $4 coffee every day, like don't think about it. Like check in every couple months, but like that should be a pleasure thing and just do it, fine, but check in on it. It's when you're going to buy a home or a car or a college loan, that's when you like hit the brakes. And a lot of times financial places will try to make those easy and painless when like it's the big ones that you need to stop and check your yourself on. It's like the little ones, let them go for a while, check in now and then because they add up, but pick your spots.
What I find fascinating about this conversation about part of your book is that, we trust ourselves so much and then we overvalue what we have. And I thought that was so fascinating how you painted that in your book. So can you actually walk us through, why we trust ourselves so much when we make these types of big decisions and how that is dangerous because we set ourselves up with an anchor and then we, confirm everything around us.
Right. So one of the sort of fundamental principles of behavioral economics is this idea of anchoring. How when we get a piece of information in our mind about the price of something, the first thing we get, whether it's relevant or not, we are anchored to that. The easiest example is like the manufacturer suggested retail price, like of a car, right? You walk into a car dealership and you see, oh, this car is $45,000. Like from then on, all of our assessment of the value is like that it's like a little black hole. 45, they like the gravity just draws us there. So like, oh, we can get it for $44,000. What a great, like we're saving $1,000. Or oh, it's only $50,000. Wow, that's not so bad. Like we've been anchored to that. And the science of it is fascinating because it is again, my co-author did this great experiment, like where he found it's kind of arbitrary. Like they literally found like this thing called arbitrary coherence, where they would do like experiments and essentially say, okay, here's here's some wine, right? Wine you can't identify the price of. But like, here's some fancy wine. Now let me ask you a question. What are the last two digits in your phone number? Oh, and would you pay that amount, whatever, 19 or 72, for this wine? And then what would you pay for this wine? So phone number, totally unrelated, but like, let's make it seem like it's connected. And over, and I've done this experiments in groups before. If you're in the lower quartile, like your last two digits are 25 or under, you're going to price that wine lower than if you're in the higher quartile, 75 to 99, just because of your phone number. Just because it's been suggested that that is the price of the wine, that's just where you go. And it is like, when I do that, it's a great way to demonstrate. Like, I often will do it. Like, I'll have when people can a bottle of white, I do it. I explain what just happened, and then we say, okay, now let's try this red wine, and tell me the last three digits in your social or some other random number, and I do it again. It's like the same result, even if you know it's happening.
Yeah.
And that's like an incredibly powerful thing to know, to understand. I mean, because it's not just prices. Like the classic, it was in the book, the classic story of black pearls. Right? Black pearls were not a valuable thing, but Harry Winston, the jeweler, started displaying them next to diamonds, and suddenly they were sort of anchored to diamonds, and people thought they were valuable.
Yeah.
So many, you could go on, and I see, I don't want to brag or mention who has it, but someone has a Peloton in the back, right? Now, I happen to have a Peloton. I think they're awesome. They're also pretty expensive, and part of that is like, it's anchored to this like super healthy, high level lifestyle. So I'm sure that's a premium.
Right.
For sure.
And I'll say, so to your point about like trusting ourselves, what I just described is sort of how like marketers use anchors against us, but we sort of do it ourselves. Like, again, we don't like to make decisions. Like, I consider myself a smart guy, but I don't like thinking. So like, once we make a decision, we sort of don't want to make that decision again.
Right.
So we sort of anchor to our past decisions. And I'm going to go back to this coffee thing because it's the middle of the afternoon where I am. If we go to a coffee shop one day and we're like, oh, do I get the $5 latte? We decide, right? And then the next day we probably go in, and instead of thinking, oh, is it a good choice? We're like, oh, I did it yesterday, so that's probably right. And the next day we go in and be like, I've done this 2 days in a row. I'm obviously smart, right? I'm not going to question my own self.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it becomes just a habit. And that's sort of how we self-anchor, is if we make a decision one time, rather than go through the process again, we'll make it again. Like, I know, like I leased 3 cars in a row. I did auto leases, which some may say is bad, but whatever, I did it. And I know the second and third time I didn't give it as much thought, because I was just like, oh yeah, this is how I did the last time.
Yeah.
And I'm supposed to be smart. Like, I'm not.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting how those patterns like may lead to people either living above their means or living below their means, just based on how they've been living recently. You can see how it cycles out,
Yeah, it's a challenge. And then you get people that sort of suggest like, this is the way you're supposed to live. Right? I mean, I don't want to get too philosophical, but like the American dream of like the home with the picket fence, the 2 kids and all that has been a social anchor for a long time. And I find it fascinating reading about it, like how, they always talk about millennials, but I think it's just people that have been through 9/11 and a recession and a COVID. Like, they're like, that's not important to me. Like, I don't want to be in debt. Like, I don't need to spend all this money. I'd rather be secure for the next crisis. So,
yeah.
And that kind of leads into how we overvalue things. You've mentioned homes, and some of us are in a process of buying a home. Some of us have a home and are doing renovations to it. And it's funny because like our sense of ownership of that causes us to value things differently. Like, we're trapped in our own perspective, to steal the language from your book. I think that's so fascinating, because that leads to one of the most important things around the endowment effect, which in today's society, I think is something that we should spend some time talking about, because that idea of like valuing something more than what it may actually be worth is something that I think is like a social issue too. Like, we value our opinions, we value what we're doing all the time more than the next person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I forgive me for just imagining the house one of you was getting with your whole room of like Peloton, the bike, and Peloton treadmill. And I'm just kidding. So yeah, the endowment effect is another big thing, and again, a sort of a foundational thing. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky are the names of the scientists that came up with something called prospect theory, which I won't get into. But the important takeaway is basically like we value stuff that we own much more highly than stuff that we don't.
Huh.
It sort of sounds a little like it sounds both obvious and counterintuitive. And the way to think about it is like, well, they did an experiment where they gave people a mug. They just put a mug in someone's hand and they said, okay, how much would it cost? How much would you pay for this mug? And the value, the average price that people said they'd pay for the mug was higher than people who just like saw that mug on a bookshelf and literally just didn't hold it because we made this like physical connection, something that like ownership of something makes us value it much more highly. And there are, from that sort of basic idea that like we overvalue stuff that we own in some way, whether physically or financially, there are a ton of offshoots that have implications everywhere. There's something called loss aversion, which you may have heard of. It basically like when the pain from losing something is much greater than the pleasure of gaining something. Right? If we lose $10, that pain is only made up by winning $20. And that is a powerful thing that has implications for investing and any sort of financial decision, because we try to avoid that loss. And again, that comes out of this idea like a loss is losing something that we have ownership of, and that ownership means we value it more highly, and therefore there's a lot of graphs in here.
Right. Finger points and graphs.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like there was a related thing that I find particularly fascinating, called the IKEA effect, which was named after the store IKEA. Like if you guys ever been to IKEA, like it's a cool social experiment, right? You watch these like couples walking around looking at all these different rooms of furniture, and over the course of like a couple hours building the foundation for a really strong and lasting divorce. And you see, it's like IKEA's figured out, right? You buy something in a box and you build it yourself. And you actually value that more than if you just paid that amount for something off the shelf, right? Like because you are owning it, you are building it, you are creating a connection between yourself and your own competence and skills and this item. And that again is part of the endowment effect. It's why stuff like IKEA works. It's why like so many other like what do you call it? Blue Apron, right? Which maybe is a sponsor. I don't want to bash on them. Blue Apron can sponsor all the podcasts. So let's not use Blue Apron. Let's use like green spatula, right? A green spatula, right? They send you a box of stuff that you cook yourself. They could, for the same price or cheaper, just send you those meals that you heat up. But like the experience of creating it gives us value. And that, again, it's all tied into the endowment effect, which makes sense. Like we're human emotional people, like being connected like to a home, right? Like you look at a home that you've lived in, and it's not just like buy low and sell high or those things, but like I value this home. This place has memories. Like my kids have messed up this, and like, excuse me, I remember a Christmas here or a Hanukkah or whatever. Like I remember moments in it, and so that the place has more value to me than a stranger walking in. Like, what's the square footage and what's your
right? Yeah. Which I think is hilarious because, there's so many times where people love to talk about how that IKEA furniture has just been at every apartment or house that they've been in. It's like, I've had this thing for 10 years.
Exactly.
It's so hard to get rid of it.
Yeah.
No one wants to buy a piece of IKEA furniture that's been made. That's my theory.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's actually true, but that's my theory.
It reminds me of that George Carlin bit about like people's stuff and how, have you noticed that other people's stuff is shit and your shit is stuff? I think the line went, but yeah, it's really insightful. It's true. We do forge these sentimental attachments to everything the longer they're around.
Jeff, let's get your insight on the science of why it bothers us when a locksmith is too efficient and still charges his $200 flat rate.
So that's all about the what you might call operational transparency or fairness or effort. Basically, when we can't judge what something is worth and we have no innate sense of the value of it, we often judge the effort that's been put in. And we use that as a measure of the fairness of a price. Like we'll pay more for a locksmith that takes an hour to open our door and sweats and swears and breaks crap than one who just walks up and opens it. What we're doing is actually paying for incompetence, right? But like, how do I measure the value of getting into my house, right? Unless I always locked out like 20 times, I don't have any market for that. So I look at the effort that this guy has made, and it seems like he's made a lot of effort. This is, it's why, stuff like artisanal and all these like flowery languages, or like a restaurant like comes up to you and they describe the menu and they like go into detail about like how a cow was raised and the milk was cared for and like the meat was massaged, and they're just selling you a cheeseburger. They sell it for $25 because they have like, it describes all the effort that's gone in, and the type of effort we think has gone into something makes a big difference. And companies know that, like Uber, right? Uber, if you're a socially conscious person, has a terrible reputation. And so you shouldn't like it. But people love Uber because what does Uber do? Like, you open up the Uber app, and first it does the effort to find out where you are. Then it shows you a bunch of cars near you. It finds these cars for you. And then you push a button and it watches, and you get to see slowly but surely as that car makes its way towards you. And studies find when we're waiting for something, if we see the effort being made, that gets us to underestimate how long we've waited and overestimate the value of the service, because we're seeing that what they call operational transparency. Now, like sometimes it's used by like an Uber or Domino's Pizza with their progress bar or Kayak. It's used to sort of like inflate it, but it's also kind of necessary, right? Like if you're, I come from as a writer or someone in the service industry, like how do you really demonstrate the value of your time, or your expertise, right? You've got to like sometimes like lawyers use hourly billing, which is stupid, but that's another conversation. But like you've got to sort of demonstrate the effort. And the classic fable here is that Pablo Picasso, the great artist, was in the park, and a woman comes up to him and says, "Oh my gosh, you're Picasso! Can you paint my portrait?" And he looks at her for a minute, takes out a brush, and like in a single stroke creates this painting. Gives it to her, and she goes, "This is amazing! You captured my essence. Like, what do I owe you?" And he goes, $5,000. She's like, "What? $5,000 took you like 1 minute?" And he goes, "No, my dear, it took me my entire life plus 1 minute." Right? Like, how do you demonstrate, as the seller, as the Picasso, how do you demonstrate your value? And as the woman, how can you possibly calculate the value of getting a Picasso in the park, right? So you fall on that effort you see. And just, again, like being aware this is what we're running into. Like, I wouldn't suggest, the hamburger that's described for 20 minutes might be delicious and worth $25. So don't, just get hamburgers out of the freezer in a gas station, but, be aware that it's happening and sort of pick your spots, if you will. And there was an advertisement once I saw on an airplane for artisanal moonshine. And I was like, that's what moonshine is. It's handmade. There's no reason for the word artisanal except to like charge more.
Another $25. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's interesting. Maybe there's a case to be made there if you're like in a job where you're working on long projects, or even just like a week-long project, to keep your managers in the loop as to your progress, because maybe that can make your efforts more appreciated.
Well, especially in this remote learning environment, which I don't know when this podcast will come out, but I'm sure we probably won't be out of remote, learning, but remote work environment. Is how do you know what work you're doing? Right? Like the challenge for managers, like you don't want to you don't want to be checking in all the time, but also like how do you let people know this stuff's happening? Especially like you said, if it's a long-term project. Because one thing if you're filling out a bunch of forms, but if you're developing other stuff, like how do you gauge that?
Do you have an idea?
Yeah, I think we should totally change the entire American economic system of employment and just blow everything up. Start again. Let's do this like in Fight Club and just like roll that giant ball down the street. I don't have any good ideas, except that I think that more frequent sort of check-ins by managers, more substantive and frequent, rather than like not frequent like every hour, but like a substantive time carved out to have a real conversation about what someone's doing like once every couple of weeks to keep things on the roll and not have it be sort of a rote box checking, but sort of like really getting into it. Now, that's a challenge. It's a lot of on the shoulders of managers, but I think everyone would benefit to really understand what people's work is actually about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
and then we blow up a bunch of buildings.
Okay, as long as at some point we blow up the buildings.
So just getting back into your book, because again, it is so fascinating and the science behind it. And you were talking about, I think one of my favorite lines in the book is how you say the flick of the tongue is like the flick of the switch. Basically, what you're trying to talk about is how you can go from language to value and our willingness to actually pay for something. So can you actually walk us along the steps of going from what we hear in terms of like the vocabulary that marketers want us to consume with to our willingness to actually behave on that?
Sure. Bearing in mind that I wrote the book a few years ago, so I'm not going to remember the exact steps, but basically, we, again, even building off of this idea of the effort that we see into something and how we like substitute effort for value is the language that we use to describe a product or service can set our expectations for what that product or service is. Whether it's using like this is artisanal or describing what the product is in certain terms or certain like really professional sounding terms, using language really sets our expectations at a certain level, and our expectations impact how we value something. If we expect, the premium ultra Tylenol to really affect our, headache, we're going to like think, oh, it does a great job, even if the regular off the shelf CVS brand is literally the same thing. It's sort of how brand names are able to charge more because they built up this expectation, this like trust in us, like, oh, it must be good.
Right.
And that is, how the flick of the tongue or the flick of a pen can impact what we're expecting out of a product or service, because it tells us, it's like a signal to us that this is what this is worth. I mean, like in many ways, advertising is right. You get a spokesperson to say, I endorse this product. They're essentially saying like, there's high value in this. It actually says nothing about the product. It just connects you. It's like, again, all these things sort of work together. It's like Harry Winston and the Black Pearls, right? Yeah. You get someone to like verbally describe them sitting with the diamonds, and that impacts our expectations and impacts our valuation of that experience. And then often, it can actually, what's interesting about expectations is it does in some ways actually impact our experience. Right? Like if you go to a fancy restaurant with beautiful candlelight and a French waiter that describes that wonderful thing and describes this wonderful wine and the music is lovely, like those are all things there to enhance our expectations, but they also do enhance our experience. Right? Absolutely. Like hearing how great something is can make it feel like it is great. So again, it's something like pick your poison, like enjoy. If you get to go to a fancy French restaurant, enjoy it and have a good time. Just every now and then, if you're going and to another situation and they try the same tricks on you, then maybe think twice.
Interesting. Yeah. And it seems like that could be true for like people. And I mean, we have seen politicians over the last few years use hyperbole and sell themselves and their successes, in sort of duplicitous ways. So I think it is important to have that sort of discerning eye, not just with experiences or services, but, with like the value that people offer you as people too,
Yes. If someone says they're the greatest ever over and over again, you might want to question their motives.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I'm thinking the same thing.
Before we get into, what we should do now that we know about all these flaws, one interesting thing that you were talking about in your book was how we overemphasize money because we love precision and the illusion of precision. Can you expand on that for us, please?
Yeah, this is something that I think people recognize in many different facets of their life. Money is measurable down to the decimal point and beyond. And it's specific and it's comparable. And when you are sort of assessing your success or your value or your life, it's sometimes really easy to just fall back on money because it's something you can measure, right? I have a net worth of $1.3275 million, right? That's the value, right? And our jobs and what we earn and how big our house is and like where we go on vacation and things about spending money, like money, particularly, you know, in American culture, like those sort of commercial things also enhance this sense of like, that's what matters is your money, right?
Right.
We talk about, you know, education reform sometimes is always geared on like, what is the like earning potential of a graduate of X college?
Yeah.
And look, I also recognize there's some sense of privilege that I get to say, well, it's not just your earning potential that matters, it's your experience. And like, are you thinking philosophically? Like, I recognize there's a privilege in my being able to say that. Nonetheless, I do firmly believe that like a focus just on money isn't healthy. And the reason why this happens isn't just from a social construct, but it's just hard. Like, how do you assess the value of your life? Like, how do you assess what's happiness, what's love, what's meaning, what's purpose? Like, that's hard to do, right? And so, again, it's easy to look at a number and maybe look at a number and compare it to where you were 2 years ago to see you're growing or you're failing or you know you can retire next time to look at numbers to do this because they're easy. And the irony is the number itself is emotionless, but it's a substitute for an emotion, and we end up getting emotional around it.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I'm not saying everyone should go to therapy and read philosophy all the time. Maybe once in a while.
Yeah.
No, this entire episode is like, it's more about just helping people have improved decision making. That's what this is about.
Yeah. And I will say to that point, like there are some interesting studies coming out that when we are facing a financial decision and we're feeling stressed about something, that if we stop and connect to these higher ideals and higher values, purpose, meaning like, why are we thinking about buying this item, whether it's a house or otherwise, that actually like reduces some of the stress around it and helps us make a more rational choice because it gets us out of the like, oftentimes we're just focused on the nitty gritty and it's like there's a lot of noise around here. If we stop and think about like, okay, how does this connect to my big picture? That can help us make a better choice. Because a lot of times it's about picking those spots where you're going to stop and think about the decision, stop and get something close to the opportunity cost.
I see.
And,
Yeah.
you know, so often we don't, right? We're caught up in the noise, like trying to buy a home, and you tend to get caught up in like, okay, what are the payments? What's the interest rate? Like, okay, what are the closing costs and all this? And you just sort of get in the process and you don't stop to think, is this what matters to me?
Right.
And doing so can actually help us make better decisions. And I'm excited to see it, more and more studies come out along these lines because I think that my instinct, without the full scientific backing, is that that's a healthy way to do things. Again, not every day when you're buying coffee, don't like get the barista involved in like this is so my spirit can be free. Like you don't need that.
Yeah. But as you write in your book, a wise man knows himself to be a fool, but a foolish man opens his wallet and removes all doubt.
I don't know if I came up with that line, but I like it. I might have come up with that line. Every now and then I write some, you know.
I mean, you were an award winner.
The book is a horrible process. I love having written a book. I hate writing a book. So.
How long were you working on this one, this most recent one?
All of my life. This took 3.5 years. We went through a few different versions and like I was doing other projects at the time. It took longer than it should have, but it took a while. We actually did a cool version, or I wrote a cool, didn't get all the way through, that was like a conversation between the devil and an angel. And like, it was like your worst financial self trying to argue with your better financial self. It didn't hold together, but I was very hopeful that it would.
That's cool.
That's a great idea. And in terms of ideas, I know that, you know, we've been talking about things like Acorns, a company like Acorns that helps, you know, it helps you easily save for retirement. So that's a step in the right direction. What is some other technology that some of our listeners could be thinking about right now? If they're sitting at home bored and they're wondering, well, how I can help in this situation, we obviously know, like, let's try to create something that's thoughtless, frictionless, and painless. But what are some things, like tangible ideas, you might want to share with us?
Sure. One, there are a handful of good ideas out there, and there are always more being developed. One would be to use technology to set up, like if you're getting automatic payment from your job, if you have a job, congratulations, to set up a little savings account and have some of your money go into that savings account every paycheck. It doesn't have to be like your retirement. That's a separate thing, but you should fund that too. But like what happens is we tend to look at our checking account as the signifier of how much money we have to spend, like our discretionary spending and how much money we have. And if we put a little money in a savings account, we essentially are hiding it from ourselves. It's still there to use, right, if you need it. But then, like, instead of spending $1,000 a week, you spend $800 a week. And we find that, like, there's this thing called the hedonic treadmill, which is basically like the idea, like, we adjust to whatever level beyond like a level or above a level of just existence and subsistence. We adjust to sort of whatever level of spending and living situation we have. So you can kind of trick yourself into putting aside that money. And then you end up saving a little more and you end up not overspending because it's like that extra step of friction to then, if you want to spend that extra couple $100. There is something that has worked well is, especially now that all of our money is often easy, all of our spending is often easy to see in one place, like a credit card bill and a debit card and all that's in one place, is if you find you're overspending, go through a month or 2 months of spending items and with someone, and I would suggest not with a spouse or someone who you're emotionally connected with, but like with a trusted person, or even write it yourself. Explain why you made each purchase that you did. And if you go through 150 items, you'll start to see some patterns, or you start to see some things you don't need, right? Like Disney Plus. I haven't watched anything I did. I'm done with The Mandalorian. Why do I need that, right? Like,
right.
You can get rid of it. You'll start to see your decisions. And the fact that, as you said before, we're sort of becoming cashless, like we don't have a wallet, like it's all there for us to see. That's a good way to start to identify what your issues are. And then, if it's stuff that you feel like you can't control, find a way to do that. There's ultimately, like, the issue of self-control is really what comes into play so much. Even when we know the right thing to do, we often still make that mistake, right? Because there's a lot of reasons why. And so instead of trying to like say, I need to have more control, and being like the tough guy that's like, I can just discipline. It's not discipline. You set up systems, right? You make it so that you disable the automatic withdrawal into your cable bill, so you have to pay it every month. You make it so that you can't you can't go to your liquor store and buy booze at 2 a.m. I don't know what the example is, but you know what I mean? You make it so, okay, here's the stuff I have trouble with. Let me stop making that part of Apple Pay. Let me stop making that automatic. Let me like change it so that it's hard for me. Put barriers in your way. At the same time, if there are habits that you want to start, like saving more, reduce the barriers to those habits. Go to your HR department and say, I would like you to, and this is what HR departments for, I would like you to start putting more money into my 401k. I want you to put money, help me do this so that every month it becomes automatic and frictionless. The more you can identify those habits that you have that are both good and bad, the more you can create barriers for the bad ones and reduce them for the good ones. And sort of the sort of overarching thing that I tend to suggest is like, we don't connect to our future selves, right? We literally like think of Jeff in 20 years as a different person than Jeff right now. And that's why we have such a hard time with exercising, why we have a hard time with eating right, why we have time with like saving and making long-term financial decisions. So the more we can connect to that future person or the future outcomes, the better. If we start thinking about retirement, not as this vague notion for old people, but as like really like in 2042, I want to be in Florida playing golf and driving an Eldorado to go pick up my third wife or whatever it is. That's only because they'll all divorce me now. Whatever that specificity is, one way to make it more connected and to lower the barriers to saving for that future too. So I sort of find myself babbling a little bit. Hopefully some of that in there is useful. Lower the barriers, increase the benefits, and
regain some control too.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And also, like I said at the top, sorry, one thing. Like I said at the top, talk about it. There's no shame in these mistakes. Like that's the biggest flaw I think we have. We don't talk about money. We talk about like, oh, I spent this money. We show off, but we don't talk about how we're thinking and the mistakes we make. And I really hope that people can start to do that, because that's going to be the real thing that helps us. When we admit, I don't know what I'm doing with my retirement. I don't know what I'm doing with X, Y, Z. Like, that's the big thing you can do. Start talking to people. Find someone you trust. Right? Sometimes it's the financial advisor. Sometimes it's some guy on a bus. I don't know. Find whoever it is.
Yeah, no, I was gonna bring up that very point, because I've heard you speak before on some of your YouTube videos about how this book kind of opened up the importance of talking about money to you, and how you wanted to make a more concerted effort to be transparent about these problems when you're in conversation with friends and family. I thought that was just so interesting. Like you brought up a moment ago about the idea of like going through a statement with a friend of yours, and like I can't think of anyone in my life that I would feel comfortable doing that with. And I think that's just by virtue of us having sort of this, everyone has different sort of feelings of unease about money, and it's a very private thing. So I think you're absolutely right that it is something we need to get over in order to be able to be thinking about money more responsibly.
And all my friends will tell me when they're up 100%, but they won't tell me when they're down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's my social revolution, is to get people to talk about money more. But it is sensitive. Again, it even ties in, I think, like if money is how we value ourselves as people, whether it's cultural reasons or not, like that's really sensitive. That's hard to be like, hey, I have no savings, friend. Like, you want to have a drink? Like, I need one.
It's on you.
Yeah. You won't have to pay for it until a month later anyway. Don't think about
it. Exactly.
Yeah. No, seriously, Jeff, thank you for your time, because Jay and I are passionate about this too. We're passionate about helping people. Like, we're not trying to tell people what to do. We're just trying to guide them to understand the psychology at play and how maybe they can think about their own lives a little bit differently.
Awesome. And if any of your listeners want to reach out through my website or social or whatever, which you can slap up somewhere.
Totally.
Yeah, we'll do that in show notes. And let's end this episode with the final question that we've been asking all of our guests recently. And that is, don't be scared. What do you think is a modern masterpiece?
That is an excellent question. I got to say, I'm counting it as modern, even though I realize now it's 1979. But the movie Being There is an underrated classic. I don't know if anyone, Peter Sellers, the guy who was sort of famous for playing Pink Panther. It's the satire, and like in light of recent politics, it's also particularly poignant. It's just one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's still, I guess it's around 40 years now. It still plays out well.
Thanks for giving me something to do tonight.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.